Edmund, what are you doing? Grace Bennett's voice barely made it past her throat. The ballroom around them glowed under golden lights and towering crystal chandeliers. Laughter floated through the air. Waiters moved gracefully between tables with trays of champagne. Somewhere behind the crowd, a string quartet played soft music that suddenly felt painfully out of place. Edmund Laurent didn't answer her immediately. He simply looked at her the way someone looks at a stranger who has said something inconvenient. Cold. Detached. Then he sighed. Not the sigh of a confused man. The sigh of a man annoyed. Grace, he said quietly, this really isn't the place. Her stomach twisted. 3 years. 3 years together, and suddenly she was an inconvenience. She stepped closer to him, lowering her voice so the nearby guests wouldn't hear. You asked me to come tonight, she reminded him softly. You said this gala was important. It is. His tone was flat. Grace's eyes moved slowly to the woman standing beside him. Tall. Beautiful. Draped in a red dress that clung to her like it had been painted onto her body. Her lipstick matched the deep shade of wine in the glasses around them. She didn't look uncomfortable. She looked entertained. And the way her hand rested casually on Edmund's arm made something cold crawl through Grace's chest. Edmund, Grace whispered, who is she? For a moment he said nothing. The music continued. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed loudly across the room. Then Edmund did something that made the air leave Grace's lungs. He pulled the woman closer. Right in front of her. Everyone, Edmund said loudly, turning slightly toward the cluster of investors and guests nearby. People began looking over. The CEO's son speaking meant attention. My apologies, Edmund continued smoothly. There's been a small misunderstanding tonight. Grace's heartbeat began pounding in her ears. Misunderstanding? His arm tightened around the woman in red. Grace, he said, glancing at her like she was part of the audience now. This is Sandy. The woman gave Grace a slow smile. Not friendly. Not apologetic. The kind of smile someone gives when they already know they've won. Then Edmund finished the sentence that shattered 3 years of Grace's life. She's the woman I'm actually going to marry, Edmund announced. Hello, soul family. Hope we are all doing good today. Before we continue, if this story already has you hooked, take a second to support the channel. Like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever watched someone throw away something they didn't deserve? Because today's drama is only getting started. Now, let's continue. The room went silent on hearing Edmund's statement. Not completely silent, but the kind of quiet where whispers immediately start spreading. Someone gasped softly. A glass clinked too loudly on a table. Grace's hands went numb. Edmund, she breathed. Surely this was some horrible joke. A misunderstanding. But Edmund's expression didn't change. Sandy's smile only grew. You should have told her sooner, Sandy said lightly, brushing imaginary dust from Edmund's jacket. Dragging things out is always messy. Dragging things out. Like Grace was a problem he had postponed dealing with. She stared at him. 3 years together. 3 years of late nights helping him prepare presentations. 3 years of defending him when investors doubted him. 3 years of believing they were building something real. You're serious, she whispered in a broken tone. Edmund looked mildly uncomfortable now, but not guilty. Just impatient. Yes. The word landed like a stone. You can't be serious, Grace said, her voice trembling. Edmund, we live together. We did. He corrected her quickly. Did. Not do. Did. Grace's chest tightened. Behind him, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. At the far end of the ballroom, standing near the tall glass windows, was a man whose presence changed the entire air of the room without him saying a single word. Alexander Laurent. Edmund's father. The billionaire who built the Laurent empire from nothing. Tall. Broad shoulders. Silver streaks in his dark hair. His expression was unreadable. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't smiling. He was simply watching. Watching them. Watching her. For some reason, that made the humiliation burn even deeper. Edmund cleared his throat. Look, Grace, he said, lowering his voice now that the announcement had been made. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Harder. She stared at him. You just told an entire ballroom you're marrying someone else. Yes. And I'm the one making it hard? Sandy laughed softly beside him. You see what I mean? She murmured. Drama. Edmund rubbed the back of his neck. We had a good run, he said. A good run. Like they had been some temporary arrangement. Like Grace hadn't rearranged her entire life around him. I stayed with you when your company nearly collapsed, she said quietly. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. That was business. I defended you when investors pulled out. Again, he said sharply, business. And what about love? Grace asked. For the first time, Edmund actually looked surprised. Love. The words seemed to hang between them like something foreign. Grace, he said after a moment, lowering his voice even more, don't do this here. The ballroom was already buzzing with whispers. People pretending not to stare. Sandy's hand slid possessively across Edmund's chest. You told me she'd handle it better than this, she said. Handle it. Like Grace was an employee receiving termination notice. Something inside her finally cracked. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The kind of crack that changes something forever. Grace took a slow breath. All right, she said. Edmund blinked. All right, he repeated. She nodded. If that's your decision, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady, then there's nothing left to talk about. Sandy raised an eyebrow, clearly disappointed that there wasn't going to be a bigger scene. Edmund looked relieved. Good, he said quickly. Good. 3 years reduced to a convenient exit. Grace turned to leave. But before she could take a step, Edmund added something that made the entire room feel colder. You can have the apartment for a month, he said. She stopped. Not turning around. Just standing there. 1 month should be enough time for you to figure something else out. Something else out. The word resounded in her ears. Like her life was an inconvenience he needed to tidy up. Behind him, Sandy chuckled softly. Edmund, she said sweetly, you're being generous. Grace finally turned around. Not angry. Not crying. Just tired. Keep the apartment, she said quietly. Edmund frowned. What? I don't want anything that belongs to you. The words surprised even her. But once they were spoken, they felt right. She walked past them. Past the tables. Past the curious stares. Past the whispers. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with every step, each one echoing louder than the music. When she reached the tall glass doors leading to the balcony, she finally stopped. Not because she wanted to. Because her legs suddenly didn't feel steady anymore. The cold night air rushed against her face as she stepped outside. City lights stretched endlessly below the building. Cars moved like glowing rivers through the streets. Behind her, the gala continued as if nothing had happened. Grace gripped the balcony railing and let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. 3 years. Gone in 5 minutes. You handled that with more dignity than most people would. The voice came from behind her. Deep. Calm. Controlled. Grace closed her eyes for a second before turning around. Alexander Laurent stood near the doorway. His dark coat hung perfectly over his broad shoulders. Even in the dim balcony light, his presence felt overwhelming. Powerful. Not the loud kind of power his son liked to show off. The quiet kind. The dangerous kind. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he walked forward slowly, stopping a few feet away. Mr. Laurent, Grace said softly. Her voice sounded smaller than she wanted it to. His eyes studied her face carefully. Not rudely. Not curiously. Almost thoughtfully. I imagine tonight was not what you expected, he said. Grace let out a small, humorless laugh. That's one way to describe it. The city wind lifted a few strands of her hair. He watched them fall back against her cheek. You're not crying, he observed. She shrugged slightly. Not yet. Something flickered briefly in his eyes. Not pity. Something else. Something deeper. He embarrassed you, Alexander said quietly. There was no question in his voice. Just a statement. Yes. He looked back toward the ballroom for a moment. Through the glass doors, Edmund and Sandy were laughing with a group of guests. As if nothing important had happened. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. Then he looked back at Grace. My son, he said slowly, has always had difficulty recognizing value. Grace blinked. That was not the response she expected. I'm sorry for the scene he caused, he added. You don't have to apologize for him, she said gently. His gaze held hers. Perhaps not. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just heavy with things neither of them were saying. Finally, Grace straightened. I should go. He nodded once. Yes. She walked toward the door. But just before she stepped inside, he spoke again. Grace. She turned back. Alexander Laurent rarely called anyone by their first name. Especially not someone like her. Yes. For a moment it seemed like he was deciding whether or not to say something. Then he simply said, Take care of yourself tonight. It sounded simple. But the way he said it carried something else. Something almost protective. Grace nodded. You too, Mr. Laurent. Then she walked back into the ballroom. Past the whispers. Past Edmund. Past Sandy. And out of the building. She didn't look back. But if she had, she would have seen something unexpected. From the balcony above the ballroom floor, Alexander Laurent was still standing there, watching her leave. His expression unreadable. But his eyes followed her long after she disappeared into the night. 3 days passed. 3 long, quiet days. Grace Bennett spent most of them inside a small temporary apartment she had rented on the edge of the city. The place was clean but unfamiliar, with white walls that echoed every sound she made. Her suitcase was still half unpacked on the floor. She hadn't had the energy to finish. The silence felt heavier than the humiliation from the gala. Because silence gave her time to think. And thinking brought memories she couldn't seem to stop. Edmund laughing in their kitchen. Edmund pulling her into late-night strategy meetings. Edmund promising her they were building something bigger than both of them. She had believed him. Every word. Grace sat at the small dining table with a cup of tea that had already gone cold. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. An unknown number. For a moment she considered ignoring it. But something in her stomach tightened. She picked up. Hello. There was a pause. Then a deep voice spoke on the other end. Grace. Her spine straightened instantly. She recognized the voice immediately. Alexander Laurent. For a second, she didn't respond. The billionaire rarely called anyone personally. Most people went through assistants, secretaries, entire layers of communication before ever hearing his voice. Yet here he was, calling her directly. Mr. Laurent, she said carefully. I didn't expect your call. That's understandable. His voice was calm, measured. The same quiet authority it had held the night of the gala. I hope I'm not disturbing you. No, she said quickly. Not at all. Another small pause followed. Not awkward. Just thoughtful. I wanted to ask if you would join me for dinner tonight. Grace blinked. Dinner? With him? Her fingers tightened slightly around the phone. I'm not sure I understand, she said honestly. That's fair, Alexander replied. His tone remained steady. I would like to speak with you. About Edmund? No. The answer came immediately. Then, what about? Another pause. Longer this time. About you. Grace felt her pulse quicken. About her? Mr. Laurent, she began carefully. I'm not sure that's necessary. I disagree. His voice was still calm. But there was something firm beneath it. Not forceful. Just certain. Dinner, he said. 7 o'clock. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no. Not because she disliked him, but because she didn't want to step back into anything connected to Edmund Laurent. Yet another part of her remembered something from the balcony that night. The way Alexander had looked at her. Not with judgment. Not with embarrassment. But with something thoughtful. All right, she said quietly. Good. I'll send a car. That's not necessary, she replied quickly. It is. His tone softened slightly. I insist. Before she could protest again, he added, I'll see you tonight, Grace. Then the line went quiet. She lowered the phone slowly. Dinner. With Alexander Laurent. Grace stared at the wall for a long moment. Then she sighed and stood. If nothing else, she thought, She at least owed him the courtesy of hearing what he had to say. The restaurant overlooked the river. Tall windows framed the glowing city skyline, while candlelight flickered softly across polished tables. It wasn't loud. It wasn't crowded. It was the kind of place where conversations stayed private. When Grace stepped inside, a hostess greeted her immediately. "Miss Bennett." Grace nodded, slightly surprised. "Mr. Laurent is already here," the woman said with a polite smile. Of course he was. The hostess led her through the quiet dining room. Grace spotted him before they reached the table. Alexander Laurent sat near the window, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his posture straight but relaxed. Even seated, he commanded attention without trying. When he noticed her approaching, he stood. The small gesture caught her off guard. Men like him rarely stood for anyone. "Grace," he said. "Mr. Laurent." "Please," he said calmly, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "Sit." She did. For a moment neither of them spoke. A waiter poured water into their glasses before disappearing quietly. Alexander studied her for a brief moment. "You look better than I expected," he said. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Should I take that as a compliment?" A practical observation. That made her smile slightly. The first genuine smile she had managed in days. "Thank you." The waiter returned, taking their orders before leaving them alone again. The quiet between them felt strangely comfortable. Finally, Grace asked the question sitting in the middle of the table. "Why did you ask me here?" Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. "Because there are things I wanted to say to you that were not appropriate to discuss at a public gala." "Things about Edmund?" Alexander shook his head once. "No." His eyes held hers steadily. "Things about you." Grace felt her shoulders stiffen slightly. "I'm not sure what there is to say. There is quite a lot." She frowned slightly. "How so?" Alexander folded his hands together on the table. "I've known you for 3 years." Grace blinked. "No, you haven't." "Yes," he said calmly. "I have." She leaned forward slightly. "I've barely spoken to you more than a handful of times." "That is correct." "Then how could you possibly know me?" Alexander's expression remained composed. "Observation." The word hung in the air between them. Grace waited. And after a moment, he continued. "You spent countless evenings at the Laurent offices helping Edmund prepare presentations." She felt a small wave of surprise. "You noticed that?" "Yes." He spoke simply. "You stayed late with him when his first company nearly collapsed." Grace stared at him. "You were aware of that?" "I am aware of everything that happens inside my company." He paused. "But more importantly, I noticed the way employees treated you." "How did they treat me?" "With respect." She hadn't expected that answer. "You spoke to them," Alexander continued. "You listened to them. You remembered their names." Grace looked down briefly. "That's just basic decency." Alexander tilted his head slightly. "You would be surprised how rare that is." The waiter arrived with their meals, placing the plates down quietly before leaving again. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then Grace asked softly, "So you invited me to dinner, because you've been observing me?" "Yes." She studied him carefully. "You're a very strange man, Mr. Laurent." That earned a faint smile from him. "I've been called worse." Grace picked up her fork slowly. "I still don't understand why it matters now." Alexander's expression shifted slightly. "Because my son discarded you like something replaceable." Grace froze. The bluntness of the statement caught her off guard. "And I find that unacceptable," he finished. She looked up at him. "Why?" Alexander held her gaze. "Because you are not replaceable." The words were simple, but the way he said them made something warm stir unexpectedly in her chest. She looked away slightly. "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness." His tone was firm. "It's accuracy." Silence settled between them again. Outside the windows, the river reflected the city lights like scattered stars. Finally, Grace exhaled softly. "You know what the worst part was," she said. Alexander didn't interrupt. He didn't even look guilty, she continued quietly. Her fingers tightened slightly around her glass. "It was like I was an inconvenience he had finally decided to deal with." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My son, he said slowly, has spent most of his life surrounded by people who tell him what he wants to hear. Grace gave a small, sad smile. Yes, I noticed. Alexander studied her face again. You still care about him? It wasn't a question. Grace shook her head gently. No. But after a moment she added, I care about the man I thought he was. Alexander didn't respond immediately. Then he said something quietly that made her heart skip slightly. He was fortunate to have you believe in him. Grace met his eyes. For the first time since the breakup, she felt something unexpected. Not pity. Not sympathy. Respect. And strangely, comfort. They continued talking. About work. About the city. About small things that slowly made the evening feel lighter. At one point Grace laughed. A real laugh. And Alexander noticed something he hadn't expected. When she laughed, her entire face changed. The tension disappeared. Her eyes warmed. For a brief moment, she looked completely carefree. Alexander found himself watching her longer than necessary. And when their hands brushed accidentally while reaching for the same glass of water, neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact lasted only a second. But it left something behind. A quiet awareness neither of them spoke about. Outside, the city lights shimmered across the dark river. And somewhere in the quiet space between them, something new had begun. For the first time in 3 days, Grace slept through the night. No memories pulling her awake. No replaying the gala in her mind. Just quiet. When morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of her small apartment, she opened her eyes slowly and lay still for a moment. Dinner with Alexander Laurent had not gone the way she expected. She had assumed it would be awkward, brief, formal. Instead, they had talked for nearly 3 hours. Not about Edmund. Not about the humiliation. But about everything else. Work. The city. His life before success. Alexander had even told her something that surprised her. I started my first company in a garage with 2 borrowed computers, he had said. Grace had blinked at him across the candlelight. You're joking. I rarely joke. She had laughed. And for the first time since the breakup, the tight weight in her chest had loosened. Now, as she sat up in bed, she realized something strange. She wasn't thinking about Edmund. She was thinking about Alexander. Across the city, inside the top floor of the Laurent corporate tower, Alexander Laurent stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. Below him, the morning traffic flowed through the streets like steady rivers of motion. He wasn't looking at the city. He was thinking about dinner. Specifically, the moment their hands had brushed. A brief contact. Barely a second. But it had lingered longer than he cared to admit. Alexander was a man who understood control. Control built empires. Control prevented mistakes. And yet something about Grace Bennett disrupted that quiet discipline. It wasn't her beauty, though she was undeniably beautiful. It was something else. Something far rarer. Integrity. Strength that didn't demand attention. Dignity even while being humiliated. Alexander rarely admired people. But he admired her. And admiration, he knew, could become something far more complicated if he wasn't careful. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in. His assistant stepped inside. Mr. Laurent, the investors from Zurich are waiting. Alexander nodded once. I'll be there in 5 minutes. But before turning away from the window, he did something unusual. He reached for his phone and sent a message. Grace had just finished pouring herself coffee when her phone buzzed. She glanced down. Her heart skipped slightly. It was Alexander Laurent. The message he sent was simple. Are you free this evening? She stared at the screen. Her first instinct was caution. But another part of her remembered the calm warmth of last night's conversation. She typed slowly. Why? The response came a minute later. I thought you might like to walk. Walk. Not dinner. Not business. Just a walk. She hesitated. Then typed back. All right. The riverfront was quieter in the evening. Streetlights reflected across the slow-moving water while the city skyline glowed softly beyond it. Grace arrived a few minutes early. She leaned lightly against the railing, watching the water drift past. Grace. She turned. Alexander approached from the pathway behind her. He wasn't wearing his usual formal suit tonight. Just a dark coat and a charcoal sweater beneath it. The more relaxed look softened the sharp edge of his usual corporate presence. "Mr. Laurent," she said. He stopped beside her. "You can call me Alexander." She blinked. "That feels strange." "Why?" "Because you're my ex-boyfriend's father." Alexander's mouth curved slightly. "That is technically correct." She laughed softly. "Still strange." "Alexander," he repeated calmly. After a moment, she nodded. "All right. Alexander." Something in his expression warmed slightly at the sound. They began walking slowly along the river path. For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable, just peaceful. Finally, Grace said softly, "You do realize this is the most unusual situation I've ever been in?" Alexander glanced at her. "I suspected it might be." She smiled faintly. "Dinner with my ex-boyfriend's father, followed by a river walk." "When you say it like that," he said dryly, "it does sound unconventional." She laughed again. The sound lingered in the cool evening air. After a moment she asked, "Why are you really doing this?" Alexander looked ahead at the water. "Because I enjoy your company." The honesty of the answer caught her off guard. "That's it?" "That's enough," he said calmly. They continued walking. A gentle wind lifted strands of her hair across her face. Without thinking, Alexander reached out slightly, then stopped himself. Grace noticed the movement. Their eyes met briefly. Neither of them commented on it. But the air between them shifted slightly. They walked a little further until the first raindrop fell. Grace looked up. Another drop landed on her cheek. Then another. "Of course," she sighed softly. Alexander opened his coat pocket and pulled out a small umbrella. "You planned this," she said suspiciously. His eyebrow lifted. "I checked the weather forecast." He opened the umbrella. They stepped closer beneath it. The space between them became very small. Close enough that Grace could feel the warmth of his shoulder beside hers. Close enough that Alexander could smell the faint scent of jasmine in her hair. They began walking again. The rain grew heavier, drumming softly against the umbrella above them. Grace glanced sideways. "You know," she said quietly, "this would be extremely scandalous if anyone from your company saw us." Alexander's expression remained calm. "Then it's fortunate that no one has." She smiled faintly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet stretched again, but this time it felt charged. Grace noticed something about him. Despite the rain, despite the narrow space under the umbrella, he never touched her. Not accidentally, not casually. His control remained absolute, and somehow that restraint felt more intimate than touch itself. Finally, she spoke softly. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why didn't you stop him that night?" Alexander knew exactly what she meant. The gala. Edmund's humiliation. He answered honestly. "Because it wasn't my place." Her brows drew together slightly. "You're his father." "And you were his partner," Alexander replied calmly. "Interfering would have made the situation worse." She sighed. "You're probably right." They walked another few steps. Then Alexander said something quietly. "I regretted it afterward." Grace looked up at him. "You did?" "Yes." "Why?" His eyes met hers. "Because you deserved better." The rain softened slightly. The streetlights reflected across the wet pavement around them. Grace felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. No one had said those words to her yet. Not a friend. Not family. Not even herself. "You barely know me," she said. Alexander shook his head once. "I know enough." They stopped walking. The river moved slowly behind them. Grace looked up at him. He was taller than she remembered. The umbrella cast soft shadows across his face. His eyes were steady, quiet, and closer than she realized. Her heartbeat quickened. Neither of them moved. For a brief moment, it felt like the world around them had gone silent. Alexander's gaze dropped slightly to her lips, then immediately returned to her eyes. Control. Always control. Grace noticed. And something about that restraint made her heart race even more. Finally, she stepped back slightly, breaking the moment. We should probably head back, she said softly. Alexander nodded. Yes. But neither of them moved for another second. Then they turned and began walking again. This time a little slower. The rain faded to a light drizzle. And both of them knew something had almost happened beneath that umbrella. Something neither of them had expected. Across the city, inside a luxury penthouse apartment, Edmund Laurent stared at his phone. His expression darkened. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. Sandy leaned casually against the kitchen counter. "Relax," she said with a smirk. "It's just a picture." Edmund looked at the screen again. The photo was slightly blurry, taken from a distance. But the two figures beneath the umbrella were unmistakable. Grace and his father, walking side by side along the river. Edmund's jaw tightened. What the hell is he doing with her? Sandy shrugged. Maybe he felt sorry for her. Edmund didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen. Something ugly stirred inside his chest. Not love. Not regret. Pride. And pride had just been wounded. Edmund Laurent did not sleep that night. The photo sat on his phone screen like an insult. Grace and his father walking side by side beneath an umbrella. Close. Too close. He stared at it for a long time, jaw tight, the muscles in his neck tense. Across the living room, Sandy lounged comfortably on the couch, scrolling through social media like the situation amused her. "You're overreacting," she said finally. Edmund didn't look up. "Am I?" "It's just a walk," she replied with a shrug. "Your father probably felt bad for her." Edmund's eyes lifted slowly. "My father doesn't feel bad for anyone." Sandy tilted her head slightly. "Well, maybe he made an exception." Edmund didn't answer. Because the truth was something about the image disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. Alexander Laurent was not a sentimental man. He was precise, controlled, strategic. He did nothing without purpose. So why was he spending time with Grace? Edmund stood abruptly. "Where are you going?" Sandy asked. "To talk to him." She smiled faintly. "Oh, I would love to see that conversation." Edmund grabbed his coat. "I'm sure you would." The Laurent corporate tower was nearly empty by the time Edmund arrived the next morning. The elevator carried him straight to the top floor. Alexander's office doors were already open. Inside, the billionaire stood behind his desk reviewing documents, the morning light stretching across the polished floor. He didn't look surprised when Edmund walked in. "Good morning," Alexander said calmly. Edmund shut the door harder than necessary. "We need to talk." Alexander finished reading the page in his hand before setting it down neatly. "About?" Edmund stepped forward and placed his phone on the desk. The image of Grace and Alexander appeared on the screen. Alexander glanced at it briefly, then looked back at his son. "Is there a question you'd like to ask?" Edmund's patience snapped. "What the hell are you doing with her?" Alexander didn't raise his voice. "Walking." Edmund scoffed. "You think this is funny?" "No." "Then explain it." Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. "There is nothing to explain." Edmund stared at him. "That's my ex-girlfriend." Alexander's expression didn't change. "I'm aware." "And you're walking around the city with her like it's normal?" "Yes." Edmund laughed harshly. "You've got to be kidding me." Alexander's gaze remained steady. "You chose to end your relationship with her. That doesn't mean you get to." "Get to what?" Alexander's voice cut through the room with quiet precision. Edmund stopped. For a moment, the silence between them felt heavy. Then Edmund said what he was really thinking. "You're doing this to make a point." "No." "Then why?" Alexander stood slowly. Even at his age, he towered slightly over his son. "Because I enjoy her company." Edmund stared at him like he had misheard. "You what?" Alexander repeated calmly. "I enjoy her company." "That's ridiculous." "Why?" Edmund ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "She's my ex." "And?" Edmund blinked. "And that's weird." Alexander folded his hands behind his back. "What exactly do you find strange?" Edmund gestured angrily toward the phone. "You spending time with someone I used to date." Alexander's expression hardened slightly. "You discarded her in front of 200 people." Edmund's jaw tightened. "That was different." Explain how. Edmund hesitated. Alexander continued calmly. You made it very clear that she no longer had a place in your life. That doesn't mean you get involved. Alexander's eyes sharpened slightly. Involved. Edmund realized what the word sounded like the moment he said it. The room went quiet. Wait, Edmund said slowly. You're not actually. Alexander didn't answer. That silence was enough. Edmund stared at him in disbelief. You're serious? Alexander's voice remained calm. I have done nothing inappropriate. But you're thinking about it, Edmund snapped. Alexander didn't deny it. And that was the moment Edmund lost control. You've got to be insane, he said harshly. She's 10 years younger than you. More than 10, Alexander corrected calmly. And she used to date your son. Yes. Edmund threw his hands up. Do you hear how that sounds? Alexander's expression didn't change. Yes. And you're still doing it? Alexander stepped closer to him. I am speaking with a woman you chose to humiliate. Edmund's jaw clenched. That was my decision. Yes. And you should respect that. Alexander's voice dropped slightly. I respect that you made a decision. Edmund crossed his arms. Then act like it. Alexander held his son's gaze for a long moment. Then he said quietly, respect works both ways. Edmund frowned. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Alexander said evenly, that if you had treated her with basic dignity, we would not be having this conversation. Edmund scoffed. You're taking her side? Alexander didn't hesitate. Yes. The word landed like a slap. Edmund stared at him. You're unbelievable. Alexander picked up the phone from his desk and set it aside. Are you finished? Edmund let out a sharp laugh. Oh, I'm not finished. Alexander waited. Edmund leaned closer across the desk. If you think this is going to embarrass me, you're wrong. This is not about embarrassing you. Then what is it about? Alexander's answer came slowly. Integrity. Edmund shook his head. You always liked her more than me. Alexander's expression hardened slightly. That's not true. Yes, it is. Edmund pointed toward the window. You watched her like she was some kind of saint. Alexander didn't respond. Because there was some truth in the accusation. Edmund laughed bitterly. You know what? Go ahead. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Go ahead and take her out to dinner. Edmund's voice turned sharp. Date her. Alexander's gaze sharpened slightly. You're not in a position to give permission. Edmund shrugged. I don't care anymore. He turned toward the door. But before leaving, he said something colder. Just remember one thing. Alexander waited. Edmund looked back at him. If you cross that line, don't expect me to pretend we're still a family. Alexander didn't respond. Edmund walked out. The door closed heavily behind him. The office fell silent again. Alexander stood still for a moment. Then he walked to the window. Far below, the city continued its endless movement. His phone buzzed softly on the desk behind him. He turned. A message from Grace. Thank you for last night. I haven't smiled like that in a while. Alexander looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he typed a reply. I'm glad. After a pause, he added another message. Dinner tomorrow? He set the phone down. Outside, clouds moved slowly across the sky. Alexander Laurent rarely crossed lines. But the one Edmund had just drawn no longer seemed particularly important. Meanwhile, across the city, Grace stood near the window of her apartment holding her phone. His message still glowed softly on the screen. Dinner tomorrow? Her heart beat a little faster than she expected. Because she knew something now that she hadn't allowed herself to admit before. She liked spending time with him. More than she should. And, somewhere deep down, she was beginning to look forward to it. Grace read Alexander's message 3 times before answering. Dinner tomorrow? Her thumb hovered over the screen. She should say no. That would be the sensible decision. Simple. Clean. No complications. Yet the thought of not seeing him again felt unexpectedly disappointing. She exhaled slowly and typed. All right. The reply came almost immediately. I'll pick you up at 7. Grace stared at the message. Pick you up. The words sent a small, nervous flutter through her chest. This was starting to feel less like friendly conversations and more like something else. Something neither of them had said out loud. The next evening, a black car waited outside her apartment building. Grace hesitated for a moment before stepping outside. The driver opened the door for her. "Miss Bennett." She nodded politely and stepped inside. Alexander was already seated across from her. His dark coat rested neatly against the seat beside him. When he saw her, his eyes softened slightly. "You look beautiful." Grace blinked. Alexander Laurent was not a man known for unnecessary compliments. The sincerity in his voice made her cheeks warm. "Thank you," she said softly. The car began moving. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Grace glanced at him. "Where are we going?" "You'll see." She smiled faintly. "That sounds suspicious." Alexander's mouth curved slightly. "Patience." 20 minutes later, the car stopped near the river. But not the same quiet path they had walked before. This part of the riverfront was alive with soft lights, music drifting from nearby restaurants, and couples strolling beneath glowing lanterns. Grace stepped out of the car and looked around. "It's beautiful here." Alexander joined her on the sidewalk. "I thought you might like it." They began walking slowly along the water. The city skyline shimmered across the river like scattered stars. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Grace said softly, "You know something?" Alexander glanced at her. "What?" "If someone had told me a week ago that I'd be walking through the city with you." She laughed lightly. "I would have said they were insane." Alexander's eyebrow lifted. "And now?" She looked up at him. "Now I'm starting to think it might not be the worst idea." Something warm flickered in his eyes. They stopped near a small outdoor cafe overlooking the water. Alexander pulled out a chair for her. She sat, still slightly surprised by the gesture. The dinner itself was quiet. Not awkward. Not formal. Just two people talking easily under the soft glow of lantern light. Grace told him stories about her childhood. Alexander listened carefully. At one point she said something that made him pause. "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" "What?" "You don't treat me like Edmund did." Alexander's gaze sharpened slightly. "How did Edmund treat you?" She shrugged lightly. "Like I was part of the background." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "You are not background." The intensity in his voice made her heart skip. The conversation slowed after that. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then the music from a nearby restaurant drifted across the river. Soft. Slow. Almost like a quiet invitation. Alexander stood. Grace looked up at him. "What are you doing?" He extended his hand. "Dance with me." Her eyes widened slightly. "Here." "Yes." She laughed nervously. "There are people everywhere." "I'm aware." Grace hesitated, then slowly placed her hand in his. Alexander guided her toward the small open space beside the cafe. The music carried softly through the warm night air. His hand rested lightly at her waist. Hers rested against his shoulder. They began to move slowly. At first Grace felt awkward. Then she noticed something. Alexander moved with calm confidence. Steady. Controlled. Safe. The city lights reflected softly in the river behind them. "You're good at this," she murmured. "I had practice once," he replied. "With your wife?" Alexander paused for the briefest moment. "Yes." Grace noticed the flicker of memory in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said gently. He shook his head slightly. "There's no need." They continued dancing slowly. For a moment the rest of the world seemed to disappear. Just the music. The water. The quiet warmth between them. Grace looked up at him. He was already looking at her. Something shifted in the air. Alexander's hand moved slightly at her waist. Not pulling her closer. Just studying her. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips. Then back to her eyes. Grace felt her heart racing. This moment had been building for days. Maybe longer. She didn't step away. Neither did he. Alexander lowered his head slightly. Slowly. Carefully. Giving her time to stop him if she wanted. She didn't. Their lips met softly. Not rushed. Not overwhelming. Just gentle. Warm. The kind of kiss that feels like the beginning of something real. When they pulled apart, Grace's cheeks were warm. Alexander studied her face carefully. You're not regretting that? It wasn't a question. Grace shook her head slowly. No. Then she smiled softly. I was wondering how long it would take. Alexander actually laughed. A rare, quiet sound. Across the city, Edmund Laurent sat in a private lounge with Sandy. His phone buzzed. He glanced down. Another message. Another photo. This one clearer than the last. Grace and Alexander. Dancing. Edmund's expression darkened instantly. What now? Sandy asked. Edmund turned the screen toward her. Sandy stared. Then laughed. Oh my God. Edmund's voice was ice cold. He kissed her. Sandy leaned back in her chair. Well, looks like your father moves faster than I thought. Edmund stood abruptly. I'm ending this. Sandy smirked. Ending what? Edmund's jaw tightened. This. He gestured toward the phone. This whole ridiculous situation. A week later, the Laurent Foundation hosted its annual charity gala. The ballroom was larger than the last one. More guests, more media, more attention. Grace stood near the balcony, wearing a deep blue evening dress. Alexander approached beside her. You're nervous. She sighed softly. Your son is going to be here. Yes. And the press. Yes. She looked at him. You're very calm about this. Alexander met her eyes. Because I've already made my decision. Before she could ask what he meant, the ballroom doors opened loudly. Edmund walked in. His gaze moved across the room. Then stopped. Not on anyone, but on them. The room fell slightly quieter as people noticed the tension. Edmund approached slowly. You really did it, he said. Alexander didn't move. Yes. Edmund laughed bitterly. You stole my girlfriend. You gave me away, Grace spoke calmly. Edmund ignored her. He looked directly at his father. You think this is some kind of victory? No, Alexander's voice remained steady. Then what is it? Alexander reached for Grace's hand, holding it openly, in front of everyone. It's a choice. Edmund's expression darkened. You're choosing her over your own son? Alexander didn't hesitate. I'm choosing the woman who deserved better. The room erupted into whispers. Edmund stood frozen. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. 6 months later, the same river where they had once walked under an umbrella glowed under soft evening lights. Grace leaned against the railing. Alexander stood beside her. You brought me back here, she said. Yes. Why? Instead of answering, he reached into his coat pocket and held out a small velvet box. Grace's breath caught. Alexander. He opened it slowly. Inside was a simple, elegant ring. I built companies, he said quietly. I built power. His voice softened. But you. He looked at her with something deeper than admiration. You made my life feel alive again. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Marry me. She laughed softly through the tears. That's not even a question. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Oh. She stepped closer. Yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her again under the same soft lights where their story had truly begun. If this story made you smile, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Do you think Edmund will ever regret what he lost? Because sometimes, the greatest mistake someone can make is throwing away the person who would have loved them forever. Until next time, this is Soul Storyverse TV.